And so that's the basic idea of a boundary act. And as you can see, a boundary act is very important in determining the future history, the entire fate of a civilization. And they are normally, very often, um, they are committed by, in today's civilization, actually, on the global stage, we have boundary acts that are committed by groups like Al-Qaeda, who is a sort of late Magian fossil group. 911 was a kind of a boundary act, pushing back of Western civilization. Osama bin Laden's main idea was, in doing that, was to get the Americans out of the Holy Land, basically, to get our military bases out of the Holy Land. So it was a type of boundary act. There have been other boundary acts, such as the 1995 Tokyo subway attacks by the group known as the Aum Shinrikyo Doomsday Cult, who attempted a boundary act by leaking nerve gas into the Tokyo subways and killing something like 20 people. What they wanted to do was to reinstitute a theocratic, authoritarian state, a sort of miniature model of the ancient Bronze Age despotic state. And they wanted to overthrow the Japanese government, and to do that. That was a boundary act that fortunately failed. And these acts are today committed by what Toynbee called internal proletariats. And the term internal proletariat is a very useful term that Toynbee here can contribute to illuminating Spengler's idea of the pseudomorphosis, because very often these boundary acts are committed by internal proletariats, that is to say, groups who are within a civilization but are not of it and resent the civilization. And he thinks of the Christians as an internal proletariat within the Roman civilization, and he calls the Roman universal state a chrysalis that the Christians then shed and got rid of until they became their own sort of organism, as it were. So that's the concept of the internal proletariat, and it very much is related to this concept of the boundary act that's committed as a result of a pseudomorphosis, or a resisting of a pseudomorphosis. So then Spengler moves on in this chapter to a discussion then of early Magian springtime phenomena, and he basically says that if it's the case that Magian civilization is a civilization with its own unique identity, just like all the other civilizations, then it should be the case that in its springtime forms there ought to be analogs which are analogous or homologous to early Western phenomena such as feudalism and chivalry and the age of epic and romance and the Crusades. There ought to be phenomena, if we look carefully at early Magian history, there ought to be phenomena that correspond to this. And indeed, Spengler does find that phenomena when he looks carefully at hitherto very obscure corners of the Magian world, such as the wars between the Sabians and the Axumites. For example, the Sabians were part of the Himyarites, who were a kingdom in Yemen, in the southern tip of Saudi Arabia, who, along about 300 A.D., their great warrior ruler, who was equivalent to Arthur or Roland, was Shamar Juharesh. He was immortalized in epics and in the Arabian memory as having gone on major campaigns of conquest into Persia and as far even as China. And his stronghold was the great castle, one of the first in the world, the castle of Gamdan, which was said to have 20 stories to it. So it was a huge castle. It's in ruins now today. There's not much left of it. But Gamdan was his palace stronghold, his sort of equivalent of Camelot. And the Himyarites, his group was the Sabians, were across the Red Sea from the Axumites, and the Axumites are today where the Ethiopians are. The Axumites were possibly descendants of the Kushite kingdom of Meroe, which existed about 800 BC down to about 300 BC in Egypt, in the very far south of Egypt. And in Meroe, they miniaturized the pyramid so that each ruler was buried in a miniature pyramid, a very small one. But the Axumites had giant obelisks for their grave markers. They were the largest obelisks ever built at that time in the world. Some of them were like 78 feet high. A lot of them have fallen as the result of earthquakes. But they were there, and the practice, though, was outlawed as pagan when, in the 4th century, long about 300 AD, King Azana converted to Christianity and rendered the practice pagan and outlawed it, and so they stopped building these monoliths. But the Axumites, and this is Ethiopian, there are legends today, this is the place where the Ark of the Covenant is supposed to have eventually been taken. Coptic Christianity comes out of here. The Axumites went to war against the Himyarites on the other side of the water, and they fought back and forth. The Himyarites actually converted to Judaism in about 400 AD, since they were located in an area that was between, at that time, the great area of the Byzantine Empire on the one hand and the Persian Sassanid Empire on the other, who were in collision for centuries. And so the Himyarites decided to convert to Judaism, since it seemed like a politically neutral religion to convert to, so that they didn't have to take sides with the two great empires. And indeed, in the time of Mani, Mani was the great prophet, the founder of Manichaeanism, which is the great summation and synopsis of all the great Gnostic cults that had come before. 275 AD is about the time that he lived, and he mentions Rome and Axum as part of the great kingdoms of this period.